Hey guys, welcome back. This time we're going to take a look at some of the arcade ports that gave me no reason to go back to the arcade to play them, unless I just wanted to fight through a bunch of kids to play some snot-covered arcade cabinets, which I really didn't. These were all good enough that I could have the arcade experience right in the comfort of my bedroom, even while eating a bowl of cereal if I wanted to, which is something you probably shouldn't do if you go to an actual arcade. So let's get this one started with a port of a fighting game for the Super NES that's so good that it's still one of the best ports of the game to this day. Mortal Kombat II on the Super NES pretty much completely redeemed the original game's crappy port to the Super Nintendo. For those unaware, the original Mortal Kombat on the Super NES wasn't really great. It definitely looked the part, but completely fell flat in playing anything like the arcade. And when Mortal Kombat II hit the Super NES back in 1993, let's just say a lot of us kids were hoping for a much better port. What we ended up getting, though, was one of the best arcade-to-home ports of all time. Mortal Kombat 2 on the Super NES just really felt like we legit got the arcade version of the game at home. There was nothing that was left behind this time. It looked and played exactly like the arcade version. In fact, it was so close to the arcade that I'd actually go to my local Walmart where they had a Mortal Kombat 2 arcade cabinet just so I could compare back and forth. Yes, the arcade version does look better with its larger characters and much higher resolution, but the Super NES really doesn't lose anything in the conversion besides that. The best part though is that it actually played just like the arcade game this time, at least as far as I could tell. There may be some minor differences, but that's all it was, minor. No more FOMO this time that people on other consoles got the better playing game, because the Super NES was about as good as you could get. Hell, we even got blood and fatalities this time. Mortal Kombat 2 on the Super NES was a revelation, making all of us that felt like they wasted their money on a crappy port of the original Mortal Kombat feel completely vindicated with Mortal Kombat 2. The only other home port of Mortal Kombat 2 at the time that could lay claim to being better was the 32X version, believe it or not. And honestly, no one really wanted to spend money on a 32X just to get a slightly better version of the game. But it is an incredible port though. And that claim would actually live on through several console generations, since just about every port of Mortal Kombat 2 after these would have glaring issues with them. Whether it was the horrible load times of the Saturn, or just badly emulated versions of the game like on Midway Arcade Treasures, Mortal Kombat 2 just seemed like it couldn't stick the landing after those original home ports. Somehow, the Super NES and the 32X version still remain the best ways that you can play this game on a home console to this day. And that right there should tell you just how good of a port this was.
Fatality.
Super Street Fighter II Turbo for the 3DO was the first time that I felt like there were no compromises to the home version. And yes, you heard me, this is the 3DO version. Believe it or not, I was one of the 38 or so people that actually owned a 3DO. Now, I'm not going to do a dissertation on why the 3DO is a far better console than most people give it credit for, because it is, but I am going to talk about just how good of a port Super Street Fighter II Turbo is.
Cool. The real 3DO system from Panasonic.
When previews actually started first coming out for this, magazines were literally calling this the arcade version, with screenshots that seemed to back it up. And being a massive Street Fighter nerd, you know I grabbed this one up as soon as it hit shelves. And while the 3DO version isn't quite as arcade perfect as we were led to believe, it was so close that I just did not care. I am one of those people that is notorious for nitpicking details of ports like this. I did it all the time with a lot of games that are on this very list. But Street Fighter II on the 3DO was such an accurate port of Capcom's newest fighter that I wasn't even trying to compare. This is about as close as you could have asked for on the 3DO. And coming from the Super Nintendo version of Super Street Fighter II, well, this was a pretty big upgrade. Now, if you really want to do the nitpicking, the resolution of the 3DO isn't as high as the arcade version, making for a slightly more pixelated look. Also, the backgrounds on the 3DO version have zero parallax scrolling, which if you don't know, that's an effect where you have multiple layers of the background moving together to create depth. All you get here is just a single layer that moves back and forth. Beyond the graphics though, the 3DO version also had some control issues, though that's more of the 3DO's fault and not the game's fault. If you haven't seen it before, the 3DO controller only has 3 face buttons plus 2 shoulder buttons. That's only 5 buttons if I can do my math correctly. And if you know Street Fighter, well, it needs 6. So your only option if you didn't want to slum it with that 3DO controller was to get Capcom's mutant controller called the Soldier Pad that they released just for the Super Turbo on the 3DO. And as you can see, it's definitely unique, but it does get the job done. And I'm pretty sure you actually had to order it, since I don't think I ever saw it in stores. And you better believe I was looking, since that 3DO controller ain't too great for nothing. Still though, Super Turbo on the 3DO was the first time that I really felt like I had the arcade game at home. Nothing seemed like it had to be sacrificed for this to be playing on an admittedly very expensive console. I actually come back to this port if I want to play Super Turbo, since I just like it that much. Unfortunately, that's a lot to ask for a lot of you to do, since I'm sure you probably never even had a 3DO. And if you ever want to own one, get ready to pay a couple $100 these days. But if you ever do end up with one somehow, then do yourself a favor and pick up Super Turbo. It's one of the best games on the 3DO, and also one of the best arcade ports of Street Fighter ever made.
You win! Sega Rally Championship.
Sega Rally for the Sega Saturn was the entire reason that I eventually bought the system. The game I wanted most on the newly released Sega Saturn was Daytona, but the first time I played a demo of Daytona on the Saturn, well, let's just say I wasn't throwing my money at it. Fast forward a couple of years and I finally see previews of Sega Rally start popping up for the Saturn, which was another racing game that I absolutely loved to play in the arcade. The arcade version of Sega Rally just feels like you're playing butter. It's so smooth. It's one of those games that you can just get so good at that you just go into a trance as you effortlessly slide around corners without ever touching anything. And if that Saturn port was gonna be worth anyone's time, then it needed to replicate that feeling. And man, thankfully it does. It's not running at the same frame rate as the arcade, but it still felt so smooth on the Saturn, even when you're using a controller. And everything else that made the arcade game so good is just as good here. I mean, it's not very long since this is literally just the arcade game, but mastering those tracks in every car was just incredibly addictive to me. I used to sit in my room and play this for hours trying to get better times on each track, and I am not the one to do that for any racing game, so you know Sega Rally had to be good.
Checkpoint.
This was even one of the few games that was eventually released for Sega's Netlink service. Yeah, you could actually play this online, back on the Sega Saturn. So yeah, anybody that played Sega Rally already knows it was pretty dang special. But as for you, if you haven't played it, I still think it's probably the best racing game on the system, and one that's actually still worth playing today. Tekken 3 on the PlayStation was the home port that I didn't even think was possible. When I first saw Tekken 3 at the arcades, I knew there was probably no chance I'd be seeing this one on my lowly PlayStation. The characters were all super detailed now, complete with fully 3D backgrounds that had never even been in a Tekken game before. It looked like a generational leap over Tekken 2, which was already pushing the PlayStation pretty hard back when it was ported. So I just figured I'd be playing this one on the PlayStation 2 when it eventually came out. Shockingly though, I didn't have to wait that long. That's right, I think you already know by now, but Tekken 3 actually came out on the PlayStation, the non-sequel PlayStation. Make no mistake about it, Namco were wizards at what they could do on the PlayStation. Yes, Tekken 3 had to make some concessions to get it on the PlayStation, but it's all here. And in many cases, it's better than the arcade. The biggest thing that the PlayStation version is missing are those 3D backgrounds, since these all had to be axed and replaced with standard 2D backdrops. The crazy thing is though that it's almost not even noticeable thanks to Tekken's gameplay never really having you come into contact with those backgrounds. Yeah, they look nice in the arcade, but the 2D backdrops on the PlayStation were done so well that a lot of magazine previews were saying that they were in fact 3D. That obviously wasn't the case, but it goes to show you how effective these new backgrounds were at emulating the arcade. Besides that though, the PlayStation version of Tekken 3 is an incredible port. The characters look and play nearly identical to their arcade counterparts, and the shock of just playing it on the PlayStation didn't go away very soon. Plus all the additions that Namco added to the home port like new characters, CG endings for every character, and even 2 all-new modes put this game into the legendary category. There's a reason why it became one of the best-selling games ever on the PlayStation, and is still fondly remembered these days as one of the best games on the system. So if you're a Tekken fan and you somehow never played Tekken 3, what are you doing? Go back and play Tekken 3. It's an amazing port of an amazing game.
You win.
The House
of the Dead 2 on the Sega Dreamcast was an incredible addition to the system for light gun aficionados like me. Now, the first thing that I usually looked for when I went to arcades back then was if there were any new light gun games out. I loved playing light gun games, but sadly a lot of the arcades back then just didn't have many, if at all. I imagine it was due to the high cost of the cabinets, plus the upkeep thanks to us kids going absolutely ham on those poor plastic guns. One day though, I noticed House of the Dead 2 sitting at my local arcade, and it was love at first sight. It looked amazing, plus all the branching paths through each stage made just about every quarter spin on it feel like it was a different game. Unfortunately, due to a severe lack of funds, I couldn't take House of the Dead home 2 with me. At least until the Dreamcast version hit a couple years later, and you better believe that I was there day one ready for it. House of the Dead 2 on the Dreamcast is about as close as you can get to being arcade perfect. For all intents and purposes, I mean, this is the arcade game. I couldn't believe that it was sitting in my bedroom playing on my TV.
How could anyone do this?
Everything from the arcade game is here, like the branching paths, the annoying cheap boss fights, and the so good it's bad voice acting. Like, this is top tier voice acting here.
We're counting on you, James.
The Dreamcast even included a neat little original mode that lets you change stuff around like bullet strength and other game properties. It was fun to mess around with, and the included gun definitely made it feel that much more like the arcade version. The only downside being that it kind of just looks like a cheap pistol rather than its beefy arcade brother, but it still worked just fine. Also, if you wanted to play with another person, they were forced to use the controller unless you just bought another gun. And you can take my word for it that playing this game with the controller is not the way that you should play. A lot of the Dreamcast games at that time really banked on you feeling like you were getting the arcade version of the game at home, especially the games that Sega put out. And House of the Dead 2 was no exception. This is one of the best light gun games ever made, and the home version felt like you were cheating by being able to play a state-of-the-art arcade game right in your living room. And House of the Dead 2 is still obviously just as much fun to play today as it was back then. So you should do yourself a favor and find a way to play this game if you ever get the chance.
Thank you for rescuing me.
Sadly, that takes a little bit more effort these days since modern TVs will not work with the old light guns, but if you can find a way and have an old TV laying around, I can promise you that you'll have just as much fun with House of the Dead 2 as I did back then.
Don't care who it is, no one's gonna get away with this.
And that's going to do it for this video. Let me know in the comments if you had any experience with these games, or what your own favorite arcade port is. Going to the arcade was always something that I looked forward to, just because it seemed like it was the only place to play a lot of these games. Once they started heading home though, I definitely stopped going to the arcade as much. I used to think that was a good thing, because I didn't have to spend as much money in the arcade. But over time, man, I just really miss those arcades. Snot-encrusted cabinets and all. Unlike video stores though, you can still get that classic arcade experience if you just look hard enough for it. I've got several arcades in my state alone that legit feel like you're walking back in time every time you go to that place. So get out there and look for some good arcades. Even though these were all awesome ports, there's just nothing like playing the real deal in a real arcade. Anyway, thanks for watching this far, guys, and if you like this video, then be sure to give it a like, or even a sub if you get those arcade feels like I do. As for me, I'll be back next time with a few more games to talk about, and until then, thanks for watching.